Alrighty, I am going to transition to my screen and we'll get into the slide presentation. Let me know, Whitney, if you can see my screen. Okay, excellent, excellent. All right, we'll dive in. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Targeted Runoff Management Grant Administration webinar. As Whitney mentioned, I am Corinne Johnson, the Nonpoint Source Program Grant Manager. And just want to congratulate everybody again that you have been awarded a Targeted Runoff Management, or TRM grant for short. We're excited to provide you with the information and examples that are going to help you in administering your grant through its life cycle. The webinar today is going to provide answers to frequently asked questions and tips to avoid problems, hopefully before they arise, and try to prevent delays or complications with processing your reimbursement requests. So moving right along, everybody grab your cup of caffeine and here we go. So there's some key steps to keep in mind as we go through the grant process. And we're going to be reviewing each of these steps today: the grant agreement, the cost share agreement or CSA approval, the reimbursement request, the amendment and variance processes, the final report and letter of compliance. And as Whitney mentioned, this webinar is being recorded, so you'll have the opportunity to go back to each of these sections as you're administering your grant and review these if you so desire. And really our main goal is to try to make this grant administration process as easy as possible to navigate. So the first step in the grant administration process is the grant agreement or grant award. And all of you should have received your grant agreement, and gratefully, most of you have signed and returned your grant award document, so that's fantastic. If you haven't done so already, I encourage you to read your grant document thoroughly because it serves as the foundation for your grant implementation and your funding eligibility. So, as we go through this, we're going to pause for questions, but if you have further questions after today's presentation, we do have 8 regional Nonpoint source coordinators that can help you out, as well as staff here in Madison. And your regional Nonpoint coordinator, though, is your primary point of contact, and those of us here in Madison provide support as needed. So take a look at the map of Wisconsin here and take a look at your county location, and you can pinpoint who your regional Nonpoint coordinator is based on your position in the state. Okay, so diving right into the next section, we're going to talk about the cost share agreement approval process. Sometimes we'll refer to it again as the CSA. So we'll take a look at the procedures for filling out the cost share agreement form. That's form 3400-069. And we'll provide some examples and also some helpful hints. So what is a cost share agreement? Ultimately, it's an agreement between you, the grantee, and the cost share recipient, usually a landowner or operator. And it lists the best management practices, the BMPs, and establishes conditions and considerations under which the cost share recipient agrees to install those practices. The cost share agreement also may be used as an offer of cost sharing in accordance with the Ag Performance Standards in NR 151, and also notices of discharge or notices of intent under Chapter 243. And when is a cost share agreement required? Anytime there are BMPs being installed by a landowner or operator, in order for those BMPs to be eligible for cost sharing, there needs to be a cost share agreement in place between the cost share provider and the cost share recipient. And so that has to happen. The signing of that cost share agreement has to happen before those BMPs are installed in order for them to be eligible. So following in line with the requirements in NR 153, which is our guiding administrative code for the TRM grant program, grantees must get DNR approval from the regional non-point coordinator prior to executing a cost share agreement if it exceeds $50,000 in state share. So that would be the state share amount going to you and then to the landowner. The TRM grant website on the DNR website provides the forms, both the cost share agreement form itself, the cost share agreement amendment form, satisfaction of a cost share agreement, and release of a cost share agreement. We're not going to go into the amendment process today or the satisfaction or release process. But I will say that, anytime you make a change to or need to make a change to a cost share agreement, that amendment form is there. And for satisfactions, that is a form that is used when you're essentially establishing that the cost share recipient satisfied or did everything that they needed to do according to that cost share agreement. A lot of times we'll get requests for a satisfaction when there's going to be a land transaction. The cost share recipient is selling their property to a new landowner. The same can be said for a release. If that cost share agreement is still in its operation and maintenance period, sometimes we get requests to release that cost share recipient from the conditions and the expectations of that agreement because they're about to sell the property to a new landowner. But just know that if you have any questions about those processes, please reach out to your regional non-point coordinator for assistance in filling out those forms. So again, when you have a cost share agreement that exceeds $50,000 in the state share, you'll need to submit a draft agreement to your regional non-point coordinator for review and approval. And that cost share agreement will be reviewed to make sure that you're using the most up-to-date version of the form. And again, that's on those forms are on the DNR website. And they'll also look to make sure that the cost share percentages, the cost share rates are consistent with your grant, and that the BMPs that you have in that cost share agreement are also consistent with your grant agreement. So when you also have a cost share agreement that the total amount exceeds $14,000, or if it includes a riparian buffer or a waterway system, our code requires that cost share agreement be recorded on the deed. So once that cost share agreement is signed by all applicable parties, if the total amount of that cost share agreement exceeds $14,000, it does need to be recorded on the deed. If that CSA is only contains cropping practices, then it will be exempt. You will not need to record it on the deed. And I will point out that recording fees are an eligible cost for reimbursement. And when you're filling out your reimbursement request, we have a special practice code, code R115, for those recording fees, and those can be reimbursed as part of your request. So we're going to walk through the cost share agreement process flow a little bit. So just to review. So first, the regional coordinator, you'll send the draft cost share agreement to the regional coordinator for review and approval. When that cost share agreement state share amount exceeds $50,000, the regional coordinator will provide their edits or approve the cost share agreement. And then the grantee will review the approved cost share agreement, and both the grantee and landowner will sign the cost share agreement. And if that cost share agreement exceeds $14,000 total, it will need to be registered with recorded with the Register of Deeds office. And once that's done, then the final signed copy, registered copy, will need to be sent to the regional coordinator. Or if it only, again, has cropping practices, and if it's less than $14,000, it will need to be, it will not need to be recorded. and can go directly to the regional Nonpoint coordinator once it's signed.
Corinne,
Yeah.
can I jump in and just ask a question? Is the exceedance, this is Matt in La Crosse County, by the way, thank you.
Okay.
If the exceedance of the 50,000 occurs, and we need regional coordinator approval, is that mutually exclusive? Is that a separate item from the 14,000 exceedance? And those are two totally separate. It kind of looks like they're almost combined here, but those are two totally separate situations, correct?
Yep. I mean, what you need to do is put your draft cost share agreement together, and if the total state share, not the total cost, but the total state share exceeds $50,000, you need to send that draft cost share agreement to your regional Nonpoint coordinator for review prior to anybody signing it. So once you receive that approval, you can then proceed, the approval from DNR, then you can proceed with the landowner signing it or the operator signing it. And again, if that cost share agreement at that point has $14,000 total or more in BMPs, then it's going to need to be recorded with the Register of Deeds once everybody has signed it. So they're separate steps, but somewhat connected, just different parts of the process.
And just for clarification, so any other contract that exceeds 14,000 in total BMPs, but may not exceed the 50,000 would just, again, require the recording. It would just not be done through the regional coordinator.
That's correct. If it's let's say it's totally, if it's got structural BMPs that are $20,000 total, you wouldn't need that preliminary review and approval, but you'd still have to record it on the deed. All right, we'll move forward here. So I want to just point out that, when you are about to fill out your cost share agreement, try to pull as much information from your grant agreement. It's really important to have information be consistent through your grant administration. So in terms of populating the form, to the extent that you can pull information from your grant agreement, it's just good to have that consistency through the process. And again, the TRM grant website is listed there for your use. And we really want to make sure that you always download the cost share agreement form from the TRM grant website to make sure that you have the most current version of the form. We do periodically update it. We haven't actually since August, I believe, of 2018, but it may be ripe for some review and updates in the near future. So just always make sure you download the cost share agreement form from the TRM grant website. And there's also instructions and a checklist on the resources tab of that website. And I just want to also point out that in order to fill and save the form electronically, it is a fillable PDF form. It does need to be opened using Adobe Acrobat or Adobe Reader software. So please make note of that in terms of having the ability to open the form. So let's take a little bit of time to kind of dive into the details of the form. So the grant information section on page 1 contains information required from the grantee to identify your name, your agency name, the grantee chosen CSA number, that's the number you get to pick, your unique grant award number that was assigned by us here at DNR, and that's listed on your grant award document. The grant project name, grant program type, that's right here. Actually, let's see, get my cursor here. Here's grant project type, and then the landowner's information, which is down here. So let's take a look at a completed example. So you can see all the components are filled in. The cost share agreement number has been populated, and again, you get to choose that number. And it's sometimes helpful to assign those cost share agreement numbers in chronological order for a given project. And then one area that is sometimes left out, but that needs to be filled in is this information right here, the form information section. So be sure to populate that area with your information. So continuing down page 1 of the CSA is the property information. So actually here, hang on one second. Let me back up 1 second here. I jumped 1 slide too far here in my notes. Okay, so the property information section pretty plainly shows the name of the property holder, their address, and then also their legal description. And so you can see here, here's a completed version, a completed example. You'll notice in the legal description, it includes both the parcel number and the actual legal description. So it can be handy to have both of those. And you know, per our administrative code, cost share agreements with contiguous sites under the same ownership may all be included on one CSA. So you don't have to do a separate CSA for each individual parcel associated with your project site. If they're contiguous, you know, essentially touching or sharing a common boundary, they can all be included on that same cost share agreement. So moving on to page 2, this is where we get into the signatures for the various parties that are applicable to that agreement. So the landowner and operator is required to sign the top portion of the form, that's right here. And if the landowner, if the landowner is not the operator, they then need to sign this portion down here. So if you've got an operator and a landowner situation, both portions of that form need to be filled out. And each signature will need to be witnessed by a notary public. And the notary will need to fill in the notary section in addition to providing their notary seal or stamp. And that's down here in this area or right here. And then once the landowner or operator signs, you as the grantee will then need to sign and have the signature notarized as well. I just want to remind everybody too that it is the authorized governmental representative that is consistent with your authorizing resolution that you submitted with your grant that needs to sign the cost share agreements. So that's another issue of consistency. If you have an authorizing resolution essentially saying that your county conservationist is the person that has the authority to sign cost share agreements, we'll be looking to see that that in fact is the right person that signed that agreement. All right, so getting to the fine print, and boy, did we make it fine on this slide. But page 3 of the cost share agreement is the terms of that agreement. And we're not going to go through the minutia of this, mainly because you can't even really read it on this slide. But long story short, you know, it's really important for you to walk through these terms and conditions with the landowner or operator prior to them signing the agreement. And there's 3 sections on this form. Section A is the general requirements. Section B is the landowner or operator requirements. And section C down here are the governmental unit or grantee requirements, essentially expectations placed on you. So all parties to the agreement have a set of expectations in the conditions section. Page 4 of the cost share agreement is essentially the BMP table. And it's really important that you fill out all of the information that is asked for essentially in the shaded cells. You fill this out for each practice that is going to be installed by that landowner. And so you go across here and you can see the various data fields that we're looking for. And so you just go across, there's the field number, DNR BMP code. That will be a drop-down list and will populate the name of the practice. And actually, we'll go through an example here. I forgot that that's coming up here. We'll walk through an example of how to fill this out. And like I said before, the August 18 version, 2018 version is our most up-to-date version at this point. So if you see that on our website, you are using the most current version. Okay, so yeah, walking through then, you can see a completed example. This particular cost share agreement's got manure storage and nutrient management. Again, with the field number, the associated BMP code that we use for tracking purposes in our grant data system, the units, the quantity that are expected or planned to be installed, the actual unit cost, and then therefore the total cost, the cost share percentage, and the state cost share amount, and then the landowner operator share. Okay, so the grantee can specify the estimated maximum amount of cost sharing the landowner will receive, and that's essentially this column right here. And in this example, you're going to see the cost of the practice, in this case, the manure storage, is $350,000 to construct, and the cost share rate is 70%. However, in this case, you know, and it would be normally $245,000 to construct, but because this is a small scale trim grant, and the grant is capped at $225,000. The maximum grant award is that, and therefore the maximum amount of cost sharing that the landowner could receive is that grant award amount. So instead of being $245,000, it's actually $225,000. Sometimes this can be confusing, but just know that you have the power to essentially insert an amount based on what you're able to provide that landowner in terms of state share. Actually, I want to back up and say one more thing here. It's really important, you know, over here, when you have, if it's going to be the landowner paying for the remainder of that practice, this is where you would put that amount. If you've got other programs that are providing the local share, it's really important that you point those numbers out. And you know, when you have federal funds at play, I just want to remind everybody that federal funds can't be matched with federal funds for a given practice. So some of you will have received Section 319, the federal Nonpoint Search Program funds, as part of your grant. And if you're using those for the state share, just know that federal funds can then not be used for the local share of that practice. So the feds don't want us matching federal with federal. All right. So here you can see an example of a cost share agreement where we've got blended funds. So here down below, you can see that the various other programs are identified. In this case, it's EQIP. And the manure storage costs $260,000. With a cost share rate of 70%. And then that would normally be $182,000 then. 70% of $260,000 is $182,000. And the landowner would generally pay $78,000, which is what you see right here. However, for this particular practice, there are $150,000 of EQIP funds at play. So you can see here that EQIP is providing $150,000. So given that the practice costs $260,000 and we have EQIP paying $150,000 and the landowner paying $78,000, the state share is actually reduced to $32,000 in terms of cost sharing from the TRIM grant. So the TRIM grant is essentially paying the balance. So whenever you have situations where you've got multiple flavors of money at play, it can be kind of confusing. I encourage you to reach out to your Nonpoint coordinator if you've got questions for how to fill this out, but it's just really important that you reflect the various sources of money and who's paying what, or who paid, well, in the case of the reimbursement, who paid what. But if you've got multiple flavors of money at play, that they be reflected in the cost share agreement.
Corinne, can I ask another question? Sorry, right?
That's okay.
Specific to that particular example that you just went through.
Yeah.
So let's say in this case, for one reason or another, you could pay the balance, I assume, if state funds were available up to 100% in that particular example. Is that correct?
Well, when you say balance, in this case, in this example, the balance is the 32,000. So even though 70% of 260,000 would normally be the 182, we could pay up to 182, but because there's other flavors of money at play, we essentially are paying the balance. And that's a decision that you as the county need to make. You need to decide, okay, is TRM going to pay 150? Or is EQIP going to pay 150? I mean, that's something where you have a choice in working with the landowner on what program is going to pay what. In this particular case, the decision was made that TRM would pay 32 and EQIP would pay 150. We just want to make sure that we're not paying any more than 70%, which would be the 182.
When you say we, I've talked with you about our scenario here, and we do intend to use, obviously, our EQIP funds, and we intend to go on a lot of our practices up to 100% where the landowner pays seeding and mulching. That policy has already been approved by our committee. Okay. Our intent is to then piggyback EQIP funds, be it our unique RCPP pool, with state bonding funds to get to that 100%. The landowner pays. We don't ever intend to go over 70% with the TRM fund amount. But it's been my understanding though that we would not need to, I guess, require landowners to pay, or fill out the form for economic hardship in that scenario, because neither pot would be over 70% of the funds. Is that correct? Do I understand that correctly?
I think in general, when I say we, it means you and me, the county and DNR need to ensure that the TRM grant is not paying more than 70%. And essentially these three columns should add up to 100% of the cost. There shouldn't be a situation where more than 100% is being paid for, because that is actually a code requirement that TRM funds can't be used to pay above and beyond the 100%. So if you want the TRM grant to pay the 70 and you want some other funding source to pay the 30, that's fine. Such that the landowner pays nothing, that's totally fine.
Okay, good. Yeah, and we do in this particular example intend to have the landowner pay for seed and mulch, but that wouldn't be noted here, obviously, on the contract, I don't believe, correct?
Well, if the landowner has a cost that's associated with the installation of the practice, that cost is an eligible cost. If they have an out-of-pocket expense associated with that cropping practice, you could put it on here. I think, again, it has to do with the total cost. What is the total cost of the practice? And then applying the cost share percentage. This is the maximum amount that could be paid by the TRM grant. If you want the TRM grant to pay less than that, that's fine. If you want other funding sources to be used to pay the 30%, that's fine. If you want the landowner to pay nothing, that's fine. As long as DNR, the TRM grant, is not paying more than 70% in that case. And as long as you're not paying total more than 100% of the total cost.
You answered it. Thank you.
Okay. All right. All right, the last page of the cost share agreement is essentially available for any special conditions that you'd like to put and add to that agreement. And there's an initial box consistent with all the other pages. You'll notice that there's the cost share agreement number self-populates and the name of the landowner populates, and the landowner operator will need to initial and date each page through the agreement. So just some reminders here. Make sure you download the most current version of the form. Make sure that that cost share agreement is recorded on the deed if the total agreement amount exceeds $14,000, minus those exceptions that we talked about already. Make sure that the cost share agreement is signed by that governmental authorized representative that's in your authorizing resolution. And make sure, I should probably list this bullet first or second, make sure you get that pre-approval from DNR if it exceeds more than $50,000 in state share prior to having the landowner sign it. Because if there's any changes, you're not going to want to have to go back to the landowner and have them sign a new version. So I'll pause here for questions if anybody else has questions. Matt, you're allowed to ask more questions if you'd like. That's just fine.
So Corinne, we do have quite a few questions coming through the chat box.
Okay.
First up is many CSAs exceed $50,000, but wouldn't these steps all be appropriate for all CSAs?
The requirement to get the pre-approval from your regional non-point coordinator is for CSAs exceeding $50,000. And yes, you're correct. Many of our cost share agreements, a majority of our cost share agreements, your cost share agreements, do exceed $50,000. So yes, essentially these steps apply to almost all cost share agreements. Again, that requirement about the $50,000 threshold is in code. And so, you know, it's something we could consider down the road if we all thought and felt that this should happen, that pre-approval should happen for all of them. That would need to be changed in code in order to require that.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Next question. For contiguous properties, is there any benefit for the grantee or landowner to submit separate agreements if that will make a difference in going above or staying below the $50,000 amount? Or is this beyond the step regardless?
Well, I think it's an expectation that you do put all contiguous parcels on one cost share agreement. I will say that the $50,000 pre-approval is not a daunting step. We're just looking to make sure that that cost share agreement is consistent with your grant, essentially, to set you up for success. You know, and frankly, I don't think you're going to want to have additional paperwork of multiple cost share agreements with the same landowner. And I don't think your landowner is going to want to have multiple cost share agreements necessarily. So I think it's safe to say that, you know, we would expect if you're going to be providing cost sharing on multiple parcels, multiple contiguous parcels, get them all on the same cost share agreement and save yourself the recording fees. If you know, multiple are greater than $50,000 or $14,000, excuse me, save yourself the hassle, get it all on one.
Okay, thank you. Are electronic notary accepted?
That's a good question. I've never been asked that. I'll have to check into that. I think most of ours are still doing it the old-fashioned way, the hand signatures and the traditional stamp or seal. But let me get back to you on that.
Okay.
As we try to make more of our processes electronic, that's a good question.
Yeah. All right. Why is there a 70% cost share rate listed for nutrient management in the example when the landowner is covering the entire cost?
The cost share rate still applies, well, that's actually a good question. I'd have to go back to my slide. The cost share rate applies for all practices. If in the end they decided that the landowner was going to cover the entire cost, then that's what they would put in the column, is that they would reflect that the landowner paid for all of it. That may be an error on my part in my example.
Okay.
But regardless, you're essentially you're telling the story in the cost share table that the cost share rate applies to all practices. If you in fact decide that the landowner is going to pay for 100% of it, you probably could modify the cost share agreement to say 100% for that practice. That might be an error on my part.
Okay. And just for the sake of time, we've got one more question. If we didn't get to your question, we are taking down names of who's asking, so we will get back to you. But just to make sure we end on time, we'll just give you one more question, Corinne, right now. If NRCS equip is unknown or not a for sure deal, do you fill out the amounts on the CS table as there is no equip funding? And if it comes in as helping the project funding, is an amendment needed?
I would recommend an amendment in that case. I think that it's important to note when you've got other flavors of money at play, and give us a heads up on that. I would say that I can't guarantee that everybody's doing that out there, but I would recommend that, just so that we can kind of connect the dots through the process. I think ultimately, it's very important, and it will be really critical and expected that you're going to have to tell us on the reimbursement form who's paying for what. So if you didn't do it in the cost share agreement, you definitely will have to do it on the reimbursement form. But I would recommend that you do process a cost share agreement amendment, and just make it very clear to that landowner, so the landowner knows too that you've got different flavors of money at play, and it'll just keep everybody on the same page through the implementation of the practices for that landowner.
Great, thank you. So yeah, just as a reminder, you can direct your questions to the question monitor through the chat box. And if we didn't get to your question in this section, we will get to them after the webinar. So you can continue on.
All right, let's dive into the next section. Everybody's favorite section, the reimbursement request. This is probably the most important section of all. So again, we're going to walk through some of the procedures on how to fill out the reimbursement form. That's form 8700-336. We'll provide some examples and some helpful hints. So just a couple questions to pose to you, or that we get actually sometimes, is, why is it important to provide all of the information in that reimbursement request? Sometimes we refer to it as the RFR, the request for reimbursement. And when may I request a reimbursement on my particular grant? So going back up to the top question, the main reason why we need you to fill out all the information in the reimbursement request is that, in many cases we are trying to document not just state money, but actually federal money too, and make sure that we're showing that it was used in accordance with the rules and statutes and the various funding requirements. And we also have various reporting requirements and audit requirements associated with these grant programs. So it's just really important that we provide all the necessary documentation to show that the money was used appropriately. And then in terms of when can you request a reimbursement, in terms of a TRM grant, you can only seek essentially reimbursement for installed practices. In the case of BMP implementation. Grantees cannot seek reimbursement until a BMP has been fully installed or implemented. And then again, this is associated with BMP costs. I'm not talking about local assistance at this point, which we'll get into later. But this is in terms of installed practices, a BMP has to be fully installed before you can seek reimbursement on it. And your final reimbursement request does need to be submitted within 60 days of the end of your grant. In most cases, it's March 1st. And so you definitely will need to get your reimbursement request in no later than that as your grant expires. And I did mention before that in terms of the reimbursement of fees, recording fees are eligible, and you should use that BMP code R115 to request reimbursement. Now, other kinds of fees are not reimbursable. That can be state or local permit fees, attorney fees, environmental cleanup costs. In case of grants that have any kind of property acquisition associated with them, whether it's fee title or easements, brokerage fees are not eligible. Real estate transfer taxes are not eligible. So just keep that in mind. But just, I think the most common type of fee that we see anyway are those recording fees, and those are in fact eligible. So speaking of local assistance, we're going to talk about the local assistance grant award. Now, our administrative code separates this out as a separate kind of grant agreement, but in fact, this type of grant award is actually combined with the BMP grant award into one grant agreement. So for local assistance, this is essentially an agreement between DNR and the grantee. And this type of funding is providing the grantee with funding for staffing activities to carry out the tasks of their project. Currently, only large-scale TRM grant applicants are eligible for local assistance awards, and they had to apply specifically, as you know, for those of you that receive it, you had to apply specifically for those grant funds in your grant award. And for the large-scale TRM grants, the local assistance cap is now 40% of the grant amount allocated to BMPs. So if you had a BMP grant amount, you were requesting $200,000 in BMP costs, take 40% of that, and that could be the amount that you could request for local assistance costs to implement your project. And the list of eligible local assistance activities is specified in code. If anybody wants a refresher as to what's eligible, the code reference is listed there. That local assistance award, as I said, is not a separate grant agreement, even though the code treats it that way. It's actually combined in the grant agreement with your BMP costs, but it is a separate budget line item in your grant award, as you should hopefully see. And the cost share rate for local assistance is 70%. It is not 40%. At this point, now that you have your local assistance award, put that 40% amount out of your heads. The cost share rate for local assistance is 70%. That other percentage is only to establish how much money you could be awarded. It is not the cost share rate. So the other type of expense associated with staff activities is the force account award. And force account work refers to the use of your own employees or equipment for project planning, design, construction, inspection, repair, or somehow improvement to a BMP. And again, that's defined in the administrative code. Currently, only small-scale TRM applicants can apply for force account. That amount cannot exceed 5% of the amount reimbursed for BMPs. And force account expenses can only be reimbursed with the final grant settlement or the final reimbursement request. So the code says that you need to receive funding approval as part of, essentially prior, but essentially it's as part of your grant application. And it is included as a separate budget line item in your grant in order to be eligible for reimbursement. Some of you in your grant award may have landowners that are facing tough times in terms of having economic hardship. And the administrative code does allow for exceeding the standard 70% cost share rate when landowners or operators can provide evidence of meeting the economic hardship requirements. And there are required documents associated with that. So any of you that that applied for greater than 70% cost share rate because of the situation associated with your landowners, you will need to, for each landowner, you will need to have them and work with them to complete the required documents, the affidavit, the notification of determination form, and then make sure you obtain a written statement from a CPA or accredited financial situation, institution, essentially talking about their the actual financial situation. And so on the determination form, essentially it walks you through a set of check boxes to make sure that all the necessary forms have been provided to us. And if you have any questions or concerns about how to complete this information, I just encourage you to reach out to your regional Nonpoint coordinator. So now we're going to dive into the details of actually completing the reimbursement form. Again, this is Form 8700 336. Here to try to take as much information from your grant agreement. Again, try to keep things consistent through the administration of your project. The form can be downloaded from the DNR website, and always make sure that you are going to the website to get the most current version of the form. And there's instructions and a checklist in the reimbursement tab on the TRM grant website. So again, let's jump in and dive into the details. So the grant information section contains, basic information required from you, essentially identifying the grantee name, the address to which you want your reimbursement check to be mailed. Then also we've got the project name, enter the applicable cost share rate for that project. The grant program type is down below here. And you're going to also include the associated grant number. I jumped ahead a little bit. The grant number that was assigned by DNR. Again, the project type is down here, down below. So, kind of following through then here on the period covered by the request, or the dates essentially in which the work was done. You have to decide and tell us whether or not this is a partial request or the final reimbursement request. And I think that's it. Oh, and I just want to remind people too that, as you're submitting your final reimbursement request, you're going to want to make sure that you also have completed your final report for the project. And we're going to talk more about the final report later on in the presentation. And that final report does need to be approved by your regional Nonpoint coordinator before we are able to issue your final reimbursement. So again, you want to download the most current form from the website, and make sure you get your cost share rate from your grant agreement. And when you're putting in your grant information, use information from that contact page that you supplied with your signed grant award, again, to make sure that mail check to especially is consistent with that information that you provided previously. Now, for the grant period, hang on one second here, I'm gonna just get caught up. For the grant period, you wanna make sure that that grant period is not outside, or that request period, I should say, is not outside of your grant period. If you have an invoice that's dated after work has been completed, make sure you put the time period for which the work was completed. You want that request period to be essentially within the grant period. Now, the payment information section, which is in the middle of page 1 of the reimbursement form, it provides a summary of the current payment record and grant balance. The grant financial data, including the total grant award, payments the grantee has received to date, and then grant funds remaining. So the blue highlighted lines are where you're going to enter the grant award amount listed from your grant agreement and total prior reimbursement amount. And the cell containing the reimbursement request total is auto-populated from table 1 on page 2 of the form and cannot be overwritten. So that's just something to keep in mind. The highlighted yellow cells on the right hand are essentially for us to use here at DNR as we process your reimbursement request. So the certification page essentially is required again to be completed by the authorized representative. It should be the same authorized representative, consistent through the grant implementation. Essentially just making sure and certifying that the information is true and correct. If you decide to type in the name of your authorized representative, if they decide to type it in and date it, that's fine. But then the reimbursement does need to be emailed from the authorized official's email account in order to be essentially eligible for consideration. And then down at the bottom, you'll see a CFA comments section here. And that again is for DNR use only. And we'll use that as we process your reimbursement, and we'll just ask that you keep that blank. So, we've mentioned the authorizing resolution. Just important to keep this up to date. If there's any changes through the implementation of your grant, there may be situations where you need to update your resolution. But in general, we recommend that instead of naming a specific person, that the authorized resolution names a job title, such that if there's staff changes, you don't have to modify the resolution every single time a staff person changes. If your county conservationist changes, as an example, over the life of your grant, you won't have to necessarily update your resolution. We'll remind you all that there is a Word doc example. We have a template example on our TRM website if you need to make updates or changes. Most everybody has a perfectly fine resolution out there, so that's great. But just know that that template does exist. So now we're going to move on to page 2 of the reimbursement request form. Table 1, you can see table 1 and table 2. And we're going to go through in the next several slides, essentially what is needed in each of these tables to make sure that your cost share agreement is accurate and we can reimburse it in a timely fashion. So first and foremost, we'll talk about table 1. So for each grant eligible BMP for which reimbursement is being requested, the following information must be provided. We'll go from left to right across the table. The name of the cost share recipient, so this is going to be the landowner or operator, or in the case of local assistance or force account, it's going to be you as the grantee. The associated DNR BMP code, which is going to be a drop-down box that will automatically then populate then the name of the practice, the associated practice, the units associated with that practice, the number of units that were installed, the total BMP expense, the total cost of the BMP, the associated cost share percentage for your grant, the eligible state share, the eligible state cost share based on that cost share percentage, and then the amount that you are specifically requesting for that practice. It could be equivalent to the eligible state share, or it could be less than the eligible state share, depending on the funding situation. And then it's hidden a little bit by the Zoom boxes here, but essentially just a yes or no question asking if the practice is complete, yes or no. There really should never be a situation where you're submitting a reimbursement request where it says that the practice was not complete. We will expect that practices, as I mentioned before, are complete, and that's the only way that we can reimburse, essentially, is if a practice has been fully installed. All right, so we'll take a look here at a partially completed table here. So you can see that the landowner's name has been entered. The drop-down box, you can see the eligible BMPs are in the drop-down box, and you'll select the BMP. And if you come to realize that a BMP was needed for your project that wasn't in the cost share agreement and wasn't in the grant, just know that you will need to do a grant amendment and a cost share agreement amendment prior to seeking reimbursement for that practice. So as soon as something changes in your project, and we'll talk a bit about this later, just make sure that you try to address those things early. Because if we see something coming in the reimbursement request that's not in the cost share agreement, not in the grant, we're not going to be able to reimburse it. Okay, so we're going to just go through again another example here and provide some tips for success, essentially, including completing table 1. So there needs to be a row in table 1 for each BMP that reimbursement is being requested. So you can see here, each BMP has a row. There's no combining of BMPs. So you can't combine all 3 of these BMPs into one row to try to simplify things. We need to see each BMP that was installed, and each BMP should get a row. So in this example, you can see that they're separated out. And thirdly, the reimbursement request column must essentially specify the amount that you're seeking. You can see here, kind of going back to my previous example, the eligible cost share amount for the manure storage was $182,000 based on the 70% cost share rate, but you, the county, are only seeking $32,000 because, as we saw, other funds were at play. So we often see situations where the reimbursement request is often less than the eligible, and that's just fine. To the extent that you can, it's really helpful to notate the BMPs on your proofs of purchase. So when you've got invoices that are coming in from the various contractors that installed the practices, if they didn't mention the BMP, like they said, you know, that they were working on a manure storage system for Farmer John, to the extent that you can put the BMPs on those invoices and name them, even in a handwritten note, that's really helpful to know what invoice is tied to what BMP. And if only a portion of an invoice is being sought for reimbursement, there too, it's very helpful to put notations on the invoice separating out the eligible and ineligible costs. It's very hard when you've got 2 BMPs on an invoice and all the costs are kind of lumped together, and one of those BMPs is going to be reimbursed and the other one isn't. So we really need you to put some sort of notation. Again, it can just be a handwritten note saying that $20,000 of this invoice is for whatever BMP that is not going to be reimbursed via this grant. Those types of little notations are very helpful. Okay, so moving on to table 2, this is where we start logging where you start logging the reimbursement documentation, and this is where each proof of purchase, in most cases that's an invoice, needs to be entered for each BMP. So additional rows can be added by selecting the plus sign on the right-hand side of this table. And right now that's being hidden by our little Zoom windows, but it's over to the far right. So all sections on table 2 going across the row need to be filled in. Let me just note here. So first off, you've got your document type. Essentially, that's a drop down. Most often the proof of purchase is an invoice. The document number is usually the invoice number. And if there's no invoice number, you're going to use the date that invoice was issued. The BMP code must be selected. So for each invoice, you have to select a BMP code for that associated invoice. And that amount then ultimately, the combined listing of BMPs, the combined rows of a given BMP are going to need to equal the same amount for that BMP then in table 1. The DNR funding amount, again, is the reimbursement amount that is being requested. So if you, in fact, have got an invoice that's for the manure storage, again, and there was only one contractor doing it, and again, we're seeking $32,000 in DNR funding for that practice, you would expect to see the $32,000 listed here. The non-DNR funding amount is going to be the remainder of the expense. So for that example, again, you're going to put the balance of what DNR is not funding in this column. The source of funding, though, also is important. You want to make sure that that's completed, and we'll make sure that you do complete it. So here too, if you've got both the landowner and equip funding at play, you're going to want to put landowner and equip in that cell. So again, kind of looking at another completed example, the total DNR amounts and non-DNR funding, as well as the grand total amount, are calculated and auto-populated at the bottom of table 2. That proof of purchase documentation in table 2 should be reconciled with the costs claimed in table 1. So to break it down, you can see here that the proof of purchase grand total amount in table 2, right here, should equal the total BMP expenses claimed in table 1, as noted in those yellow circles. And then the total DNR funding amount in table 2, which is right here, should equal the total reimbursement request amount in table 1, based on the blue circles. So you can see in this example, you're seeing both table 1 and table 2 together as it looks like on the form. In table 1, each BMP listed must have associated invoices in table 2. In table 2, the BMP code needs to be selected for each proof of purchase document. And in table 2, each proof of purchase for which reimbursement is being requested needs to be a separate line item in table 2. Oh, hang on, I want to say one more thing. Just caught it. So, as you can see in these purple and pink cells, the DNR funding amounts listed for each BMP in table 2 total and are equal to the BMP request amount, reimbursement request amount in table 1. So you total up the pink cells here, 60 plus 20 plus 20 equals the $100,000 in the reimbursement request here, and the 25 and 25 equal the $50,000 in the waste transfer system request here. And one of the things, as I mentioned before, is if you have an invoice that has 2 BMPs on it, you're going to have to list that invoice twice. This is not an example of that here, but like I said, if you have an invoice that has 2 BMPs on it, that invoice will need to be listed twice. You'll have a listing of it for the manure storage and a listing of it, let's say, for the waste transfer, separating out the costs from that particular invoice. So I just want to make a point of saying that. So now for the large scale TRM grantees that have local assistance funding as part of their award, just want to point out that for the times when you're going to be seeking reimbursement for local assistance, you're going to need to fill out this particular form, the local assistance certification form. And local assistance costs will use BMP code R53. In our grant data system, we treat the local assistance cost in terms of tracking similar to a BMP by using R53. And, you know, again, the grant cap was 40% of the grant amount for your BMP installations. The eligible costs are listed in code if you need a refresher on that. Essentially, it's costs associated with your staff time implementing your project. And the cost share rate again is 70%. So similar to BMPs, local assistance costs are eligible at a rate of 70%. So the local assistance certification form is found on the DNR website under the reimbursement tab. It's form 8700-354. And this is essentially a record of your employee labor spent on the project. So you'll start filling out the form by filling out Part A, which is the grant partner information. And then we're going to be moving on to the local assistance labor worksheet. So you're going to skip Part B, which is down here, the grant expenditures. You're going to fill out this over here, Part C, which again is that local assistance labor worksheet. Once you fill out Part C, Part B will essentially automatically populate with the applicable data that you put in Part C. And here too, this is another form where the authorized representative is going to need to sign the form, both on pages 1 and 2 to certify that information. And then once you fill out this form, it's important to remember that you're going to need to reflect those local assistance costs in Table 1 of your reimbursement request form. And you're going to reflect that in Table 1 as a BMP, essentially BMP R53. In this case, you can see the example is that, you know, on the local assistance form, they've got $976.50 in total staff time costs, times the cost share rate of 70% would leave $683.53 or 55 cents, excuse me, eligible to put as their reimbursement request for local assistance. So just make sure you carry that data over to the reimbursement form. And no surprise, with force account as well, you're going to have a form to fill out when you are seeking reimbursement for force account. And again, this is essentially a record of that staff time that was spent in implementing practices associated with your project. So again, force account cannot exceed 5% of the total project reimbursement. And this is for those of you that have force account in your small scale TRM grants. And this is a function of a bond council decision, essentially putting that limit on how much force account money could be tied to a given practice. Force account, again, can only be reimbursed with the final grant reimbursement. And this force account certification form, Form 8700-353, also is on the DNR website under the reimbursement tab. And there too, again, it's a record of your labor, your county staff labor. And so here too, you'll fill out Part A, the grant partner information, and then ultimately check the box for the force account labor worksheet. Then Part C will open up, and you'll fill out Part C, and then Section B will populate with the information from Part C. And your authorized rep, excuse me, oops, I clicked too soon. Where's my cursor? It disappeared. Authorized rep will need to sign the form. And with this example, you can see that they had $540 worth of labor, and applying the 70% cost share rate, that would leave $378 eligible for reimbursement. And here too, you're going to want to reflect the force account funds on your reimbursement form and use BMP code R54. So as we get towards the end of the reimbursement form, we've got the project status and verification sections. If you are seeking a partial reimbursement, the project status section will need to be filled in. Essentially, we're looking here for a brief status report. Is the project on track? Have you come across any complications, any delays, things that you haven't already told us? Let us know how the project is going. And then that's that part. Then with the installation verification, the grantee is going to need to check the box that the project was reviewed and that it essentially meets the applicable technical standards and specifications for the practices that were installed. And then last but not least, you'll submit your form to the regional Nonpoint coordinator, and that last section should be left blank for the regional Nonpoint coordinator's review and approval of the reimbursement. So for those of you that receive Section 319 federal funds as part of your grant, when you seek reimbursement, you will need to fill out the grant partner financial data report. And this is a form that is required as a function of you being a subgrantee and DNR essentially being a grantee of EPA. And it's to ensure that we collectively are in compliance with the federal uniform guidance. And so this needs to be filled out again for every reimbursement for grants where federal funding is at play. We use this so that we can accurately report non-state funds that were used as match to the grant, including cash contributions from your organization, force account labor, donated labor, supplies, equipment, or equipment usage. And very soon you will be, for those folks that have active grants with 319 funds, it's either in late January or early February that I send out, in fact, I'm going to be working on them next week. We're going to be working on letters that are going to go out to grantees. You'll receive a letter each year. For those grantees that have received federal funds, the letter will specify the amount of federal and state reimbursements for the previous year. And then this will help you with your needs for your single tax audit, because those of you will need to have a single tax audit completed. And so you can refer to the form itself for more information. Take a look at the grant partner financial data report, maybe before you're anywhere near seeking reimbursement, get acquainted with it. And just note that all non-federal entities that receive federal or state funds totaling at least $750,000 in a calendar year, not likely, but just want to make you know, or make you aware that they're required to hire an auditor to evaluate compliance with the Single Audit Act as amended and that federal uniform guidance. not very likely that we have any one grantee reimbursing that much money in 1 year, but you never know in the case of some of our large scale TRM grants. So, whew, we made it through the reimbursement section. I'm expecting lots of good questions because, like I said, it's everybody's favorite part of the process. So let's open it up for questions.
All right, you called it. We've got lots of questions to go through.
Okay.
So first one up, if cultural resources require an archaeologist site visit, are those fees eligible for reimbursement on a large scale TRM?
I'm gonna have to check code. I gotta do a memory refresher on that.
Okay,
Yeah.
sounds good. We will move
That's-
that to
that-
the
one of
follow-up
those-
section.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, that's one of those. I need a memory refresher. Thankfully, we don't often have to deal with archaeological resources being impacted, but we can get back to you on that.
Sounds good. Okay, do you want final reports and TRM reimbursements sent to local coordinator, then they forward them up for payment?
That's yes. And if I wasn't clear about that, I apologize. When you have a reimbursement request, it does need to, every reimbursement request does need to be submitted to your regional non-point source coordinator. When you have your final report and your final reimbursement, there too, that final reimbursement request does need to be sent to your regional non-point source coordinator. And I'm going to tell you about some changes to the final report process coming up. But just know that yes, the final report and that final reimbursement will be going to the non-point source coordinator, and they will be the first set of eyes looking at those before they then get sent to Madison, namely me, for final processing.
Sounds good. Can force account expenses cover multiple years of grant period and reimbursement be included in final request?
Yes. So if you have a small scale TRM grant with force account, like I said, the force account can't be sought for reimbursement until the final reimbursement. And that's essentially because of that 5% cap on force account. So we need to see the full BMP state share amount to be able to calculate what that 5% cap is going to be for force account. So we expect, over a 2 to 3 year period, you may have force account expenses, and you can seek those then at that final reimbursement. So it's fine for it to be over multiple years.
Sounds good. If recording fee was not included as expense in grant application, what needs to be done to include it in reimbursement?
Just put it on your reimbursement request as R115, and I essentially just add it as a BMP to your list of eligible BMPs. It's something that's expected. We haven't historically put it as a separate BMP in your grant award, but by virtue of it being a requirement for those cost share agreements over 14,000, I simply just add it in our grant system as essentially as an eligible expense. So you don't need to do anything. It's already deemed eligible by default.
Okay. Is the project status and verification form needed for the large scale projects?
Yes, I believe so. Yes, I think for any grant, essentially, where you're seeking a partial reimbursement, you're going to need to fill that out. So really, yes, for the large scale projects, you're going to be hopefully working with multiple landowners over multiple years. You're going to have practices getting done, practices coming up, and yes, we're going to want to see that status report.
Okay. Does the grant award letter note the use of federal funds for that award? This is regarding need to fill out grant partner financial data report.
Yes, on page 1 of your grant award, you will know, I think it's up at the top right corner. It shows what portion of your grant was federal, what portion of it was state, and then the total grant award amount. So you'll know if you had federal funds. And I think there's also a box down below on the first page of the grant award that talks about whether or not we will be using the state funds as match, essentially, that are tied to that project.
Okay. Can we request LA reimbursement before BMPs are installed?
Yes. Local assistance funds are used for that, for a whole host of activities associated with implementing your large scale trim project. And, you know, as an example, going out and talking with landowners, entering into cost share agreements, talking through which BMPs are needed, NR 151 compliance issues, that landowner engagement. And, you know, we would expect, particularly in the first year of your project, that you're going to be doing a lot of that. And so those local assistance funds are for that purpose. And if you want to seek reimbursement and practices haven't been installed yet, that's okay. But just know that you can combine them. Local assistance and BMPs can be combined in a reimbursement request as well.
Okay. For the sake of time, Corinne, let's continue on to the next section. If we didn't get to your question, we will again follow up after the webinar.
Okay. These next two sections, I believe, are shorter. So I think the reimbursement section is really one of the longest. So let's continue on. So next, I mentioned that we would be touching on amendments, but then we'll also discuss the variance process. So what is an amendment? Essentially, you know, an amendment is a change to one or more of the conditions in your grant agreement. Sometimes these are necessary because things change within your project. So, you know, when should you request an amendment to your grant? Definitely before the end of the grant period. Essentially the sooner the better. If your grant is expired, it's essentially too late. And you definitely should request an amendment before taking any kind of action or incurring any kind of project cost that's inconsistent with your current grant agreement. So that could be some sort of unforeseen cost that is pertinent to the project but is currently ineligible based on the wording in your grant agreement. If you've got a cost that is in excess of a particular budget line in your grant agreement, and you need to maybe move funding between budget lines, that's an example. Adding, replacing, or eliminating a BMP in your grant agreement, that's a reason to seek a grant amendment. And then changing the location of a BMP. You know, sometimes we have those kinds of substitutions being made in terms of where the practices are going to go. The location of that project area changes for whatever reason. Those are all reasons to seek an amendment, and the sooner the better. You want to seek an amendment before you incur those kinds of costs that technically are not eligible until the amendment happens. So let's dive in a little bit to the different amendment types. The first kind and the most common kind that we see are time amendments, essentially that extend the length of the grant period. NR 153, our guiding code, establishes that grant projects are 2 years for small scale projects and 3 years for the large scale projects, with a possible 1-year extension. So extending the grant does require an amendment. The next category of an amendment is a budget amendment. If a grantee wants to increase the state share amount of one or more budget lines in the grant, this is a budget amendment. In many cases, a budget amendment does not change the total grant award, but it instead shifts money from one budget line to another within the grant agreement. So as an example, if you had an award that was for $125,000 for BMP construction and $25,000 for engineering, and the grantee spends less than expected on construction and more than expected on engineering, and wants to still get awarded or reimbursed that full award amount, they would need an amendment to shift funds from construction to the engineering budget lines of the grant agreement. The next type of amendment is a scope amendment. This type of amendment is required if you change the type of BMP that is being constructed, or the location where the BMPs will be constructed. A scope amendment is also required if you plan to add or eliminate BMPs from the grant agreement. You know, I mentioned before, you know, you might have a list of BMPs in your grant award, and you come to realize as time passes that the landowner really in fact needs to install some other additional practice, or maybe they're not going to need to install a particular practice. We're going to want to see those changes reflected in a grant amendment. And then, you know, sometimes there's other issues that come up that require a change in your grant agreement. And, you know, an example might be, maybe you determine that the landowner in fact meets the criteria for economic hardship. We like to know that as early as possible, ideally with the application, but sometimes things change. And if you're going to change the cost share rate, that's going to require a grant amendment in terms of economic hardship. So really any change in the grant conditions requires an amendment. And if you don't think it falls into any one of these categories, I recommend that you get in touch with your regional Nonpoint coordinator and talk through it. And, you know, also keep in mind that your grant application has been essentially incorporated into your grant amendment by reference. So, so change, you know, change in your project generally requires an amendment. Change from that application, I should say, will require an amendment. So there is an amendment request form on the DNR website. It's form 8700-308. And, you know, essentially you're going to be looking at a list of questions in parts A and B. You can see those here, part A and part B. So based on the answers to the questions in part A and B, the form will then tell you whether a budget scope or extension amendment is required. So on this slide, you can see that the grantee filled out part A and part B, and part C tells the grantee that based on their answers that yes, an extension amendment and scope amendment are both required. You can see down here, nice big red S's or yeses. So based on the type of amendment needed, subsequent questions will appear for you, the grantee, to answer. You know, keep in mind there are, you know, always circumstances that we can't necessarily anticipate and cover in a particular form. So even if you essentially get no yeses on your form, if you've got some kind of strange situation and the form is telling you you don't need an amendment, if your gut is saying otherwise, just contact your regional Nonpoint coordinator and talk with them about your change in situation. So once you've completed the amendment request form, you'll need to submit it to your regional Nonpoint coordinator, who's going to review it and approve it and move it then to our Nonpoint Source grants team. We have a grants team that's made up of supervisors and staff, both in our runoff management program and our community financial assistance and finance bureaus. And we'll look at the amendment request and decide whether or not to approve it and issue that amendment then. Extension amendments are usually just a letter. You'll see it from DNR notifying you of that extension. But other kinds of amendments are going to actually require that you sign and return that amendment document back to DNR. So, you know, moving on to variances, you know, there's going to be certain times where, you know, maybe you're going to need a change in something in your project that isn't necessarily allowed by code, or essentially it would require an exception to the code. And so what you're seeing here is essentially, you know, what is a variance? And again, it is an exception to a requirement in NR 153 or 154 in terms of the, like I said, the guiding codes. And when is a variance allowed? A variance may be essential, you know, and essential essentially to carrying out the grant actions and the water quality objectives of your project. There may be special cases where that variance is in the best interest of the program as a whole, depending on the project situation. Variances cannot be issued when that requirement of our program is based in statutes. So we have to make sure that we cannot issue variances for any statute requirements. And I think the most common type of variance that we see is in small scale trim projects. We will sometimes get a request to extend that small scale project from a third to a fourth year. Remember that small scale projects are 2-year projects. They can request a 1-year extension, but they do have the ability to potentially request a variance for a 4th year. However, it is a statutory requirement that term projects cannot go beyond 4 years. So you're never going to see a case where we issue an extension beyond 4 years for trim. So just have a code reference here that allows essentially DNR to approve a variance. And essentially you have to meet all of these requirements, both the grantee and DNR, in order to make that approval. So the grantee is going to have to submit a written request to the DNR, citing the specific subchapter and section from which the variance is requested. And oftentimes we'll help you determine which specific section that is. And then clearly explain the circumstances to justify why that variance is needed, and essentially do that in writing. You know, address those factors of good cause, and usually we need to see that the reason for the variance is something that's beyond the control of the grantee, or essentially likely due to financial hardship of the landowner. And so for the DNR requirements, like I said, our grants team is going to review to determine, based on that written request, whether that variance is essential to, help you meet your grant actions and meet those water quality objectives for your project. Again, is that variance in the best interest of the program? And then if it's approved, we'll process the variance request. And so, your request, your written request doesn't need to be a master's thesis, doesn't need to be too long, but it should be clear. And so we just have some examples here of how to structure it. Again, provide that information about, who's requesting it, the applicable code section, what you're hoping to see happen in terms of this case, it's an extension for going to a 4th year, and then provide some justification. In this case, it was due to delays due to the weather. And so it can be as simple as that. However, we do see much more complicated situations than this. But like I said, this is the most common type that we see. So just to be clear, when is a variance request officially approved and in effect? The grantee, you will receive a letter or grant amendment signed by the director of the Bureau of Community Financial Assistance. Sometimes it'll be me signing on behalf of the Bureau director, but you will see their name on the letter. When is a variance not in effect? An email from DNR staff, as an example, an email from the regional coordinator essentially stating that they recommend approval of the request, that is not a variance. The Bureau of Community Financial Assistance is essentially the only bureau that can approve and issue those variances for the TRIM program. So until you see a letter that looks like this, your variance will not yet be in effect. This is kind of an old letter. Mary Rose Tevis, our former bureau director, recently retired, and Jim Ritchie is the new CFA Bureau Director. So you'll see Jim Ritchie's name on these letters. So I think we'll move right along, and we'll combine the final report section before we ask any more questions. We'll ask questions at the very end here. We'll keep moving along and cover the final report section and letter of compliance. So as I mentioned before, in terms of your final reimbursement request, it is also expected that you submit a final report to essentially, tell us what you accomplished, in essence, with your project. And it's required for all TRM grants. That final report must be submitted no later than the time of the final reimbursement submittal. So that essentially the latest possible date is going to be 60 days from the end of the grant period. In this case, it's generally around March 1st. And that final reimbursement request will not be processed until the final report is completed and approved. And so we've got some exciting changes, and these were mentioned. We've been actually talking about this for a couple of years. Most counties should know about this. Hopefully it does not come as a big surprise, because we've really tried to get the word out. But most specifically, for those of you with the 2021 grant awards, you were notified in your award letter and in the grant agreement conditions that there'll be a new way for submitting your final report. The DNR has been developing a BMP implementation tracking system over recent years. Most recently, or actually initially, it was for the multi-discharge variants, and for those of you that are participating in the multi-discharger variants, it's helping with the planning and the implementation of your MDV projects. But again, more recently, we're building a portion of the system to accommodate the final report content for the TRM grants. And so instead of filling out a PDF form 3400-189A, that any of you that have existing projects or have previously done final reports are familiar with, you're going to submit your report via BITS, the BMP Implementation Tracking System. And only a governmental agency would have an acronym within an acronym. But BITS seems to have stuck in terms of the naming of our data system. So just a little bit more about that. So, BITS, and we're going to go into much greater detail. BITS is a web-based system. It's a GIS-based data system. So again, instead of a PDF form, we're going to have a data system whereby we meaning you and DNR, are going to be able to enter information based on your project, and you will eventually be able to view that information and query it and be able to generate and download that information. And I just want to emphasize that just because we're going to have you submit the report via BITS doesn't mean that the content requirements are changing. In fact, they're not changing at all. The data that's going to be collected via BITS is equivalent to what's in the PDF form. And in fact, I think it's even more streamlined. And so the final touches are being put on that TRM reporting system in BITS. It's almost done. And we're hoping to launch it soon, hopefully as soon as March. And so just know that we're not going to go into in-depth training today, because we want the portion of BITS to be done. We're referring to them as modules. Have that TRM reporting module be done, and just stay tuned for an invitation and registration information on an in-depth training for TRM grantees on how to use BITS. Again, some of you with MDV may be already using BITS, may be familiar with it. The TRM module will be different in many ways from the MDV module because the program requirements are different. But you will, again, see, I think, a much more streamlined mechanism for inputting your data. And just know that for any of you that participate in both the NOD or the Urban Nonpoint Source grant programs, we are also moving towards putting the grant final report content in bits for those programs as well, and that's in development. In fact, I think the NOD portion will be launched soon after the TRM grant portion, especially since those two programs currently share a final report form, so they're going to be very similar in terms of the structure. So right now, when you go to the DNR website under the resources tab, you'll see the existing final report form. That final report form and instruction document are going to stay there until we change it and substitute it with a link to bits. If you want to go and look at the final report form as it currently stands to kind of get familiar with the content that's expected, that's fine. But just know that you won't be using that form in the future when you're working on your final report. So, in general, what is expected? We're looking to see what BMPs are installed by your project, both the type and the quantity. We do expect pollutant load reduction reporting, both for phosphorus, nitrogen, and sediment, depending on the pollutants associated with your project. You'll need to continue to specify what model you used for that load reduction modeling, and specify the total BMP cost for the BMPs that were installed per BMP, total cost per BMP. There will continue to be compliance requirements associated with your project. If your project, both TMDL and non-TMDL projects, address the NR 151 Ag performance standards and achieve compliance with the performance standards, you're going to be expected to report out on that. You'll need to continue to tell us what notice type was issued, whether it was NR 151 or 243. Was compliance achieved? Yes or no? And then you're going to have to attach those notice and compliance letters. That's no different than what is currently required in the PDF form. That's a continuing expectation. And some of you will regularly ask, especially for folks that are still kind of new to issuing compliance letters. We provided a little example here of a compliance letter. When your project, again, is addressing the performance standards, again, either TMDL or non-TMDL, all non-TMDL projects should be addressing the performance standards and working towards achieving compliance or actually achieving compliance with the standards. And so we're expecting that these letters will be sent to the landowners and then subsequently sent to DNR with your final report. And we'll just touch on a little bit what should be in those letters. It should identify the applicable performance standards that were brought into compliance by the project. It should identify the name and location of the facility where that compliance was achieved. It should remind the landowner that they are required to maintain compliance with the performance standards in perpetuity, regardless of future cost sharing. And so if you have any questions about compliance letters and the structure of them, I encourage you to talk with your regional Nonpoint coordinator. They can provide you with samples if you don't already have some in your county. I expect that probably all of you do. But if you're looking to put some polish on your letters and modify the structure, make sure you have all these components. Please check in with your regional Nonpoint coordinator. So, in terms of other required attachments, we do expect that you have pre and post implementation photos. Many of you supplied photos, pre-implementation photos with your grant applications. We'll want to see those kind of bundled again with your final report, and make sure you go out and take photos after the practices were installed. We'll want to have an aerial photo map PDF, essentially with the BMP sites labeled. We'll want to see the load reduction modeling documentation included. And if you committed to doing water quality monitoring in your grant application, any water quality monitoring results will need to be attached and uploaded essentially into bits as an attachment with your project report. And you will need to attach these documents for each site. So that's particularly important with large scale TRM projects where you're working with multiple landowners, multiple farms, and it's no different than the PDF form where you can essentially log the information for each project site and keep adding sites to your report. The same will be in bits. You're going to be able to and expected to provide attachments for each project site. And like with most everything in our grants, only the authorized government official can submit that final report. And again, they will be doing that via bits. And we'll want to see that they were in fact, again, the one that submitted that to DNR via the new data system. And just a reminder, to reach out to your Nonpoint coordinator. They're there to help you, help guide you through the grant process. Don't be shy about talking with them. If you've got questions about your cost share agreements, about your reimbursement requests, about how to fill out your final report form, that sort of thing. We'd rather have questions up front than you having to play cleanup later on. And with that, we'll take questions. There's the end of our presentation.
All right, Corinne, we've got a few questions coming in from these last two sections, and if we have time, maybe we'll circle back to some of the ones that we had to move on from. So we have a question. If you do need to evaluate economic hardship into existing grant, is there a way to increase the total grant amount to reflect the increased cost share amount?
I don't want to get anybody's hopes up. I wouldn't bet on it. I wouldn't guarantee it. To the extent that you can somehow work within your grant award. That doesn't mean you can't try. That doesn't mean you can't put in a request for a budget increase up to the grant cap, essentially, if your grant was below the cap. And the reason I say that is, we make an effort each year of allocating all available funds. And obviously, as grants are implemented and closed, sometimes we have underspending that comes in. And we can't guarantee that there's going to be sufficient underspending to meet any budget increase request. So I won't say that you can't try to seek a budget increase. I will say that we have done it in those cases of economic hardship. But don't get your hopes up. Don't assume. But you can try. You can try to put in a request, and if at that time we happen to have some available funding, we may be able to increase your grant award up to the grant cap.
All right. Should the compliance letters be recorded? How common is it?
We don't have a grant requirement that they're recorded. That might be a question for Mike Gilbertson. And I don't even think that there's an NR 151 requirement. Don't quote me on that, that they be recorded. I think there needs to be a record. You would have a record in the county. And hopefully someday in the BMP implementation tracking system, we will hopefully have a mechanism for tracking that record in bits. That's somewhere down the road. But I would check with Mike Gilbertson. He's our Ag Nonpoint Service Implementation Coordinator on that. I don't think that there's a recording requirement. There certainly isn't for the grant.
Okay. You mentioned bits. This next question is regarding that. Who do we ask questions to about bits? Because there will be questions about bits.
Really good question. You can certainly go to your regional Nonpoint source coordinator. All of the grant staff, all the people tied to the grants are getting familiar with bits. And just like with any other question associated with your project, you will be able to go to your regional Nonpoint source coordinator. I know our regional Nonpoint source coordinators are probably cringing at that as I'm saying that, because all of us are going to be on bit of a learning curve, but we're all in this together. So like with any new data system, we have done testing with counties. We have had counties participate in that. We've had DNR staff participate in the testing of it. But it's where the rubber meets the road is when you're finally actually implementing and have gone live. So just know your regional Nonpoint coordinators are there. Joanna Griffin as our runoff grant coordinator and me as the grant program manager, we're here to answer questions. And very recently, at the beginning of January, DNR was able to hire on a 2-year project position, a data coordinator for BITS. Unfortunately, it's not a full-time position. I wish it was in terms of being a permanent position. But Molly Richardson was just recently hired as our BITS data coordinator. And she will be a resource to go to as well. Granted, she's only been on the job now for about a month and a half. So be gentle. So she's learning the system and she's coming up to speed really fast. And we're excited to have her on board. But just know that we're all available for questions.
Yeah, this is Molly. I'm actually on. Feel free to fire me any questions you have. If I don't know the answer right away, I will definitely get back to you and help you with the system. So certainly you'll see my name on the materials provided to help you work through submitting TRM final reports in BITS. I'm happy to help at any point.
Excellent.
Thanks, Molly. We've got another BITS question coming in here. BITS MDV reporting is currently experiencing module and reporting problems. If we are unable to finish final TRM reporting in BITS due to technical problems, will we be allowed to submit a final reimbursement?
Yes, that's a really good question. I think, we're always going to have that PDF form available as a backup, at least in the onset of deploying the TRM module. You will still be able to submit a reimbursement. I think we may probably end up sending the PDF form to you to expedite and continue to process your reimbursement. We're going to need the final report. And what may happen then is you'd fill out the PDF form and submit that the old-fashioned way. And then ultimately, one of our staff could upload the information into BITS, and you'd be able to go in at a subsequent time when the functionality was back up and running, and take a look at that. But yeah, that's a good point. I know that MDV again, with being up and running, they're making tweaks to the system, and sometimes things don't work, as it happens with any data system. So we're gonna do everything we can to make sure that your final report can continue, or your final reimbursement can continue to move along in processing.
Great. So that was the end of the questions that came from those last two sections. We've got a few minutes here before 11. So I'm going to circle back, Corinne, to a couple of questions that we had to move past. This is back to the CSA section. When the landowner and operator are different, can the cost share funding go to either the landowner or operator? Do we always need the operator to sign with the landowner?
If the landowner and the operator are different, you always need the landowner to sign with the operator.
Okay.
And in most cases, if the operator is going to be if the operator is essentially the one doing, implementing the practices and doing the work, they're going to generally be the one on that cost share agreement receiving the funds. I think if the landowner is going to be receiving the funds, there should probably be a separate cost share agreement where just the landowner is on that cost share agreement. Have a cost share agreement for just the landowner and have a cost share agreement for the operator and landowner. I frankly have not been asked that question before in my multiple decades now of being in the Nonpoint program, but I think that would probably be the cleanest. If any of you counties, if any of you disagree with me on that, shoot me an email and I'll send out a clarification, but I think that would be the best. You have one that essentially is funneling money to the operator and one that's funneling money to the landowner.
All right. This question comes from the reimbursement section. Is there a status report that's required without a reimbursement request, i.e. quarterly or semi-annually updated reports?
We are not currently requiring quarterly reports or semi-annual reports. We have the ability or the authority essentially in code to require reports. We are working on kind of a new reporting mechanism for large scale projects. I think that those of you with large scale projects can probably expect to see a report request and more check-ins over the life of those projects. It's been pretty informal. We have regional Nonpoint coordinators that are checking in, like I said, in a more informal way. But given the large dollar amount associated with those large scale projects, there's a little bit more eyes on those projects in terms of making sure that they're moving along. There's more eyes on them by EPA because there's EPA funding at play. And we want to make sure that that 319 funding especially is moving along in the reimbursements and getting spent. And so small scale projects, I think, if you're sending in a partial reimbursement and filling out that status form, that for a partial, that's good. Make sure you fill that out. I think you can expect to be hearing from your regional Nonpoint coordinators periodically, asking how things are going. And that's just good, essentially good project management, to just be checking in with each other and keeping each other apprised of what's going on. And if you're finding, too, that there's unforeseen delays or complications, just tell us. If you have a landowner that's backing away from doing a project, we've had several grant projects that have been canceled because for whatever reason, the project was just not going to go through. The sooner you can let us know, the better. Don't wait for a call from us or a report request, because the sooner we can free up that money, the sooner we can get it out to do additional good work on the land and maybe fund more projects. So large scale, long story short, large scale trim grantees, I think you can expect a little bit more formalized mid-course reporting from us.
All right. Well, we are at 11 o'clock. So thank you so much, Corinne, for all this great information. Thank you to everyone who asked questions. It was really a great couple of hours of information sharing. So we appreciate everyone taking the time today to join us. This was recorded, so we will be sharing this out in the coming days. And we will also be following up with those questions that we weren't able to get to. Corinne, do you have anything to say at the end here, or?
No, I wish everybody the best of luck in implementing your projects, and we're excited to see the good work that you're all doing, and love seeing those reimbursement requests coming in because it means that you're getting stuff done. And just don't be shy about asking questions. We're here to try to help you get these projects on the land, and we'd rather have questions up front, rather than later. So just good luck, everybody, and we look forward to hearing from you. And thanks to everybody that helped make the webinar happen today. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thanks everyone. Take care, and we'll see you next time.